So quickly, I wanted to go over the difference between a real disease and a mental health disorder. Okay. Now, before I start this video, I want to remind people I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician of any kind. I am not a DO. I am not an ND. I am not an MD. I am not a chiropractor. I am not a dietitian. I am not a nutritionist. I am nothing of the sort. But I want to explain here, if you have a medical issue, okay, so if you are having a medical issue or if you have a medical question, you should seek the advice of a licensed medical practitioner. I'm just some guy on YouTube. I'm a layman, probably like you are. So you should seek the help of a licensed medical provider, not me, okay? Not my help. This is not medical advice. Now, moving on. What you need to understand about psychiatric disorders is they're not even really proven to exist, except for things like Down syndrome and chromosomal disorders that are actually mental, they're neurological disorders or genetic disorders that are honestly, they're not psychiatric disorders. It's the symptoms of these medical conditions that are actually the psychiatric disorders, not the actual medical diseases that are causing the symptoms, which are actually the disorders. So what you have to understand is for psychiatry, and this is the truth, you can verify it yourself, and this is from cchr.org. This was an agency, or not an agency, a not-for-profit organization that advocates for the public against psychiatric dominance and psychiatric abuse, and it was founded by a psychiatrist named Dr. Thomas Saz. So what you need to understand, there are no lab tests, no brain scans, no x-rays, and no chemical imbalance tests to verify the existence of any mental disorder. Modern psychiatry has yet to convincingly prove the genetic biologic cause of any single mental illness. You might be shocked by that. Let me get done reading though. Patients have been diagnosed with chemical imbalances despite the fact that no test exists to support such a claim. There is no real conception of what a correct chemical imbalance would look like. Dr. David Kaiser, psychiatrist. Now I know what you're saying. Well, they've isolated this gene cluster and isolated that gene cluster and blah, 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 blah. Now, I am a firm believer in genetic predisposition, behavioral predispositions, such as predispositions towards aggression, predispositions towards things of that nature. That's not what a mental health disorder is. A mental health disorder is a whole slew of different symptoms. They've never actually successfully, and you can look this up yourself, they've never actually successfully said that if you have these genes, you are definitely going to have this mental health disorder. It's never happened, okay? There have been people that have tried to come close, and then eventually they have to apologize because they were wrong. There's no biological imbalance. When people come to me and say, I have a biochemical imbalance, I say, show me your lab tests. This is from Ron Leifer, a psychiatrist. All psychiatrists have in common that when they are caught on camera or on microphone, they cower and admit that there are no such things as chemical imbalances / diseases or examinations or tests for them. What they do in practice, lying in every instance, abrogating, meaning revoking the informed consent right of every patient, and poisoning them in the name of treatment is nothing short of criminal. That is from an actual neurologist, a Dr. Fred Bauman Jr., a pediatric neurologist. Now, what you have to understand, if mental health disorders were proven to be real diseases, if they were proven to be real medical conditions, it would fall to the field of neurology. It would fall to the field of pediatrics. It would fall to the field of immunology. It would fall to the field of whatever disease was causing the symptoms, the behaviors, Okay, so if there was ever a disease state, such as a chemical imbalance, if people truly had chemical imbalances in their brains, that would no longer be handled by a psychiatrist. That would be handled by a neurologist or an endocrinologist or somebody that would deal with such an imbalance. It would not be handled by a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist does not have the ability to deal with a chemical imbalance. As I said, that would fall to a neurologist or an endocrinologist. Psychiatry makes unproven claims that depression, bipolar illness, anxiety, alcoholism, and a host of other disorders are in fact primary biologic and probably genetic in origin. This kind of faith in science and progress is staggering, not to mention naive and perhaps delusional. Dr. David Kaiser, psychiatrist. While there has been no shortage of alleged biochemical explanations for psychiatric conditions, not one has been proven. This is from Dr. Joseph Glenmullen, Harvard Medical School psychiatrist. The theories are held on to not only because there is nothing else to take their place, but also because they are useful in promoting drug treatment. Dr. Elliot Wallenstein, PhD, author of Blaming the Brain. There is no blood or biological test to ascertain the presence or absence of a mental illness. There is no blood or biological test to ascertain the presence or absence of a mental illness. So when people are telling you that your quote-unquote mental illness is the same as diabetes, keep in mind, diabetes can be proven to exist. Okay? Diabetes is not subjective. So that is from there is no blood or biological test to ascertain the presence or absence of any mental illness as there is for most bodily diseases. If such a test were developed, then the condition would cease to be mental illness and would be classified instead as a symptom of bodily disease. Okay, I'm going to move on. There's more of these. You can read them on your own. People might think that there's a lot of rigorous science that goes into the DSM and all this. There's not. These diseases are based on subjective observations that are agreed upon subjectively and voted into existence by people attending the DSM meeting. There are no objective tests in psychiatry, no X-ray, laboratory, or exam finding that says definitively that someone does or does not have a mental disorder. Alan Francis, former DSM-4 task force chairman. DSM-4 is the fabrication upon which psychiatry seeks acceptance by medicine in general. Insiders know it is more a political than scientific document. DSM-4, now it's DSM-5, has become a Bible and a money-making bestseller, its failings notwithstanding. Lauren Mosher, MD, clinical professor of psychiatry. The way things get into the DSM is not based on blood test or brain scan or physical findings. It's based on descriptions of behavior, and that's what the whole psychiatry system is. Dr. Colin Ross, psychiatrist. Okay. We can manufacture enough diagnostic labels of normal variability of mood. See, keep this in mind, normal variability of mood and thought, that we can continually supply medication to you. But when it comes to manufacturing disease, nobody does it like psychiatry. Dr. Stefan Krasuski, Harvard-trained Pennsylvania psychiatrist. In short, the whole business of creating psychiatric categories of disease, formalizing them with consensus, and subsequently ascribing diagnostic codes to them, which in turn leads to their use for insurance billing, is nothing but an extended racket furnishing psychiatry a pseudoscientific aura. The perpetrators are, of course, feeding at the public trough, meaning they're making money off the taxpayers. This is from Dr. Thomas Dorman, an internist, meaning this is a real doctor, and member of the Royal College of Physicians of the United Kingdom, fellow Royal College of Physicians of Canada. Moving on. Psychiatry admits that it can't cure you, okay? So we do not know the cause of any mental illness. We do not have the methods of curing these illnesses. Dr. Rex Caudry, psychiatrist and director of National Institute of Mental Health. The time when psychiatrists considered that they could cure the mentally ill is gone. In the future, the mentally ill have to learn to live with their illness. Norman Sartorius, president of the World Psychiatric Association, 1994. What's a cure? It's just that it's a term that we don't use in the medical, meaning psychiatric profession. Dr. Joseph Johnson, California, psychiatrist. Psychiatrists were surveyed about their fantasies about their practice. Their number one fantasy, I will be able to cure the patient. The number two fantasy was, the patient wants to know what his or her problem is. Dr. Sander Berger, Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Michigan State University, Psychiatric Times, 1998. Moving. In my last video, I had Dr. Bregan. I posted a video of Dr. Bregan explaining how psychiatric drugs are actually neurological toxins and somatic toxins. They're toxins to the whole body, honestly. If you poison the brain, you poison the body in so many ways. It is well established that the drugs used to treat a mental disorder, for example, may induce long-lasting biochemical and even structural changes in the brain, which in the past were claimed to be the cause of the disorder, but may actually be an effect of the treatment. Keep that in mind. It is well established that the drugs used to treat the disorder, they cause things like tardive psychosis and tardive dyskinesia, may induce long-lasting biochemical and structural changes in the brain, which in the past were claimed to be the cause of the disorder, but may actually be an effect of the treatment. Dr. Elliot Wallenstein, biopsychologist, author of Blaming the Brain. Now, if you remember from Dr. Bregan's video, Dr. Bregan stated that the psychiatric drugs are more damaging to the brain than a knife wound because they're so much more thorough. The damage is so much more thorough. It damages every part of the brain. Psychiatry's claim that mental illnesses or brain diseases is a claim supposedly based on recent discoveries in neuroscience made possible by brain imaging techniques for diagnosis and pharmacological agents for treatment. This is not true. Dr. Thomas Sayers, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry, New York University Medical School, Syracuse. There are increasing concerns among the clinical community that neuroscientific developments do not reveal anything about the nature of psychiatric disorders. Dr. David Healy, psychiatrist, director of the North Wales Department of Psychological Medicine. Moving on. Psychiatric drugs, being that they are, in fact, neurotoxins, as Dr. Bregan said, of course, come with a host of issues. So psychiatrists can't predict what adverse effects you might experience because not one of them knows how their drugs work. Psychotropic drugs are increasingly being exposed as chemical toxins with the power to kill. Remember, sudden death is a commonly listed side effect of most psychiatric medicines. That's why they have the black box warning. Psychiatrists claim their drugs save lives, but according to their own studies, psychotropic drugs can double the risk of suicide. And long-term use has been proven to create a lifetime of physical and mental damage. A lifetime of physical and mental damage, a fact ignored by psychiatrists. Common and well-documented side effects of psychiatric drugs include mania, psychosis, hallucinations, depersonalization, suicidal ideation, heart attack, stroke, and sudden death. Keep that in mind. Common and well-documented side effects of psychiatric drugs include mania, psychosis, hallucinations, depersonalization, which is something I unfortunately have ever since being on Seroquel, suicidal ideation, heart attack, stroke, and sudden death. Again, psychiatric drugs have side effects which include mania, psychosis, hallucinations, depersonalization, suicidal ideation, heart attack, stroke, and sudden death. Not only that, but the U.S. Food and Drug Administration admits that probably 1 to 10% of all adverse drug effects are actually reported by patients or physicians. Only 10%. Only 10%. So think about the amount of mania, psychosis, hallucinations, depersonalizations, suicidal ideation, heart attack, stroke, and sudden death. Also, it might be interesting to note that when I started experiencing suicidal ideation, that was after being on Seroquel. I didn't have it prior to that. There is no genetic proof of mental illnesses. No claim for a gene for a psychiatric condition has stood the test of time in spite of popular misinformation. Dr. Joseph Glenmullen, Harvard Medical School psychiatrist. Modern psychiatry has yet to convincingly prove the genetic biological cause of any single mental illness. David Kaiser, psychiatrist. In 40 years, biological psychiatry, in quotations, has yet to be validated, or yet to validate a single psychiatric condition / diagnosis as an abnormality or disease, or as anything neurological, biological, chemical, imbalanced, or genetic. Dr. Fred Bauman Jr., child neurologist. Moving on. Now, these are some of the wonderful documentaries that CCHR puts out. You can watch them all on their website. YouTube has taken some down, but you can watch Psychiatry and Industry of Death. I highly recommend that one. Therapy or Torture, The Truth About Electroshock. The Age of Fear. Now, they call it electroconvulsive therapy now. It's electroshock. The Age of... In fact, Dr. Bregan discussed that in his video about the damaging of the brain through electroconvulsive therapy. The Age of Fear, A Psychiatry's Reign of Terror. Now, when they say psychiatry, you have to replace psychiatry with mental health, because mental health in general has become a weapon being used against the public. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, Psychiatry's Deadliest Scam. The Hidden Enemy Inside Psychiatry's Covert Agenda. That has to do with the drugging and poisoning of our military. The Marketing of Madness, Are We All Insane? Making a Killing, The Untold Story of Psychotropic Drugging. Dead Wrong, How Psychiatric Drugs Can Kill Your Child. Okay? I very strongly recommend people watch every one of these documentaries. So this is also from the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. This is Alternatives, the Right to Be Informed. In general medicine, the standard for informed consent includes communicating the nature of the diagnosis, the purpose of the treatment or procedure, meaning the purpose of the proposed treatment, the risks and benefits of the proposed treatment, and informing the patient of alternative treatments, so he or she can make an informed, educated choice. Psychiatrists routinely do not inform patients of non-drug treatments. Okay, psychiatrists routinely do not inform patients of non-drug treatments, unless, of course, it has to do with their own agency and they're sending them to a group therapy session or something where they also make money. They do not, nor do they conduct thorough medical examinations. Now, that's true. Ask yourself, if you've been to a psychiatrist, did you receive a physical? Probably not. Okay, so they don't conduct thorough physical examinations. Okay. They do not inform patients of non-drug treatments, nor do they conduct thorough medical examinations to ensure the person's problem does not stem from an untreated medical condition that is manifesting as a psychiatric symptom. They do not accurately inform patients of the nature of diagnoses, which would require informing the patient that psychiatric diagnoses are completely subjective. Remember that. Psychiatric diagnoses are completely subjective, based on behaviors only, and have no scientific or medical validity, no x-rays, no brain scans, no chemical imbalance tests to prove to anyone that has a mental health disorder that this thing actually exists, that they're saying exists. All patients should have what is called a differential diagnosis. The doctor obtains a thorough history and conducts a complete physical exam, rules out all the possible problems that might cause a set of symptoms, and explains any possible side effects of the recommended treatments. There are numerous alternatives to psychiatric diagnoses and treatment, including standard medical care that does not require a stigmatizing and subjective psychiatric label or a mind-altering drug. Governments should endorse and fund non-drug treatments as alternatives to dangerous drugs. Okay, here are some alternatives. There's green mental health, blah, blah, blah. You can find these on your own if you go to the website. Different websites take you right to them. Dr. Wallach is a doctor of veterinary medicine and a naturopathic doctor. He is also the co-discoverer of the field of epigenetics. He independently founded the science of epigenetics, or discovered the science of epigenetics while doing research as a pathologist. Epigenetics is popular because it's being used now to reverse disease and reverse genetic or biological age. It's very common now for epigenetics to be considered, or nutrigenomics to be considered, a valid science, and it's far more valid than psychiatry, as there is actually evidence that this actually does exist and it actually does work. There's research that proves that biological age can be reversed and disease can be reversed through nutrigenomics and through epigenetics. But let's see what Dr. Wallach has to say about some common mental health issues.
Well, the Aurora movie theater mass murderer was found guilty, and we're just waiting for sentences for him. And then, of course, the most recent theater shooter down in Louisiana is going to be arraigned today, and so forth. And when you look back at all the mass murders, like Virginia State and all these kinds of things, these people have been under the care of a psychologist or a psychiatrist for years and years and years and years and years. It's not like they just suddenly came out of the woodwork. And you never get to hear an interview from their psychologist or psychiatrist, okay? And I kind of looked into this. Well, it turns out every one of these people, really 2 years or so before they went on the rampage, should have been institutionalized, but the psychologist and the psychiatrist doesn't want to give up the weekly check. And so, I'll just double the dose on this drug. Well, I'll add this drug. Many of these people are taking 3, 4, 5, 6 different drugs. The doses are very high. And we read the actual side effects of these drugs in the PDR, the physician's desk reference. Any one of them increases the suicide risk. Increases the suicide risk. Increases the suicide risk. Okay? Now, when you look at things like depression, manic depression, bipolar disease, this is what you call these diseases when people are in civilian clothes. When they're in military clothes, military uniforms, instead of bipolar, manic depression, or depression, it's called PTSD. Okay.
Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh no, I have PTSD. I'm special, because now PTSD is being diagnosed in many civilians. I have PTSD, for example. What you have to understand is, prior to PTSD being popular, some of the severe anxiety issues and hypervigilance and things of that nature were under anxiety, depression. You're anxious because you're depressed because you're anxious. You have to remember, there is no scientific basis for any of these things. It's completely subjective. In reality, what's causing the hypervigilance? What's causing the depression? What's causing these things? A lot of times it's life circumstances, and other times it's nutritional deficiencies or medical issues, but none of these things are being treated properly. And why are they not being treated properly? Because the mental health industry is purposely not diagnosing these people correctly. They are not receiving physicals. They are not receiving the medical help they need. They are not getting the nutritional therapies they need. They are not getting the help that they need to become asymptomatic or even to reduce the symptoms. Instead, they are being given neurotoxins that increase the risk of being symptomatic.
And the same disease, just the ones when you're in uniform, PTSD, and when you're in civilian clothes, it's depression, manic depression, bipolar disease, okay? And then you get, of course, schizophrenia and psychoses and ADD, ADHD, autism. All of these diseases are just nutritional deficiencies of the brain. These poor young women and men coming back from the war zones, they haven't had any vitamins and minerals for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how many tours.
Now, what's interesting is my mental health had gotten pronounced far, far, far worse after being homeless for 5 years. And I would go 2 weeks without eating. And when I did eat, it was very nutritionally deficient food. Okay, so I developed most likely some severe nutritional deficiencies while I was homeless. But you have to keep that in mind. The only difference between being homeless and being a combat veteran is being homeless, you're not necessarily, I say this, necessarily getting shot at. In some areas you are.
They haven't had any vitamins and minerals for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how many tours they did in the war zone. The government doesn't provide vitamins and minerals. They're feeding them canned food, dried food, very little fresh stuff, and it's being prepared badly, fried, and so forth. And so they come back, their brains are nutritionally deficient. They come back and they're...
Now remember, frying food does a whammy on your DNA, okay? It can cause mutations, and it can screw up your mitochondria and everything else. So keep that in mind. So fried food is not epigenetically beneficial.
Alcohol, they're doing drugs and all this kind of stuff, plus the prescription drugs, okay? And they go wacko as a side effect of the prescription drugs. And so what I would have you do is get a hold of the books and the CD and the DVD, Dead Doctor.
Now pay careful attention to the books that he mentions and the CDs and DVDs he mentions. These are indispensable at understanding the situation that's going on with mental health, okay, and physical health. Keep that in mind. This gentleman is very brilliant, and I would very strongly recommend you read his work and listen to his work and view his work. So listen very carefully to the resources he's going to mention here.
Is get a hold of the books and the CD and the DVD, Dead Doctors Don't Lie, the series, right, the book, the DVD and the CD, Dead Doctors Don't Lie. And then my newest ones, which are kind of an updates on that series, the Dead Doctors Don't Lie series, is the book Epigenetics, The Depth of Genetic Disease Transmission, and then the DVD, Somebody Needs to Go to Jail, and the CD, Public Enemy Number 1. All of these educational tools will teach you what to do. And what I would do if you have anybody that you love who's in the military or who has emotional problems, you can't cold turkey them off their medication. That has to be done slowly by the people who wrote the prescriptions. But I'd get them on the 90 Essential Nutrients. I'd get them on the Healthy Brain and Heart Pack. And I deal with people with a lot of emotional and brain problems. And so both military and civilian personnel. And so you get them on the 90 Essential Nutrients, get them on the Healthy Brain and Heart Pack, get them on the de-stress capsules, which deal with the metabolism of the brain. And then you get them on the Smart FX capsules, which have to do with providing raw materials for the brain to make neurotransmitters, for socialization properly, as well as for dealing with things like dementias, of course, and ADD, ADHD, autism, all the dementias, and so forth. And get them away from the bad foods. Absolutely no fried foods, no processed meats, no oils, no gluten. Get them off of anything that produces trans fatty acids, heterocyclic amines, or acrylamides is going to cause free radical damage to the brain. And you'll see an elimination of these problems. It's just that simple. We haven't taken care of these military personnel well. And, you know, when they come home, we have all these...
It should be noted that Dr. Wallach is a former Air Force veteran, just to point that out. So he's also talking from experience in that respect.
Wonderful groups that try to help our military personnel. You know, they take them out to horse farms where they can hug a horse or learn how to horseback ride, and they learn how to canoe, and they get in bike rides, and they have group therapies and all this kind of stuff. But how many of the 90 essential nutrients are in talk therapy? How many of the 90 essential nutrients, 16 minerals, 16 vitamins, 12 amino acids, and 3 fatty acids, are they going to get by walking together to raise money for more talk therapy? The reason why the problem is ongoing, on and on and on and on, nobody's dealing with the basic root problem, which is going on and on and on and on, nobody's dealing with the basic root problem. Going on and on and on and on. Nobody's dealing with the basic root problem. Going on and on and on and on. Nobody's dealing with the basic root problem, which is malnutrition of the brain. Which is malnutrition of the brain. Which is malnutrition of the brain. The brain requires nutrients to utilize energy properly. The brain requires nutrients to maintain itself. The brain requires cholesterol to maintain as myelin, the insulation material in the white matter of the brain. It makes up 75% of the brain weight is myelin. The white matter of the brain is 100% cholesterol. And so everything we're doing to these young kids, both men and women, coming back from the military in war zones, is driving them to become mass murderers. Okay? Not because of an emotional problem, but because of a nutritional deficiency of the brain.
So this is the lecture he did, Dead Doctors Don't Lie, which accompanies his book, Dead Doctors Don't Lie, and it's linked in the description. I'm going to show you a little bit of it. I recommend people watch this. It's linked in the description.
Do something. Well, the thing that makes my view different is I have a degree in agriculture. In the animal industry, we don't have health insurance for animals like we do people. And if we were to use a human healthcare type of system for livestock, for instance, it'd be sticker shock for you. A hamburger would cost you $500 a pound. A dozen eggs would be $250 just to pay for the health care. So we learned a long time ago in the animal industry, we keep the price of animals and animal products down to where the average person could afford to eat them every day simply by eliminating diseases. We've been able to eliminate 900 different diseases, triple lifespans, just simply with vitamins and minerals. No stem cells, no genetically engineered proteins, no wonder drugs, no organ transplants. As a kid, it always seemed odd to me that we did that for animals and not for people. And again, to make a long story short, I got into ag school. Halfway through ag school, I decided I was going to start applying for veterinary school, so when the time came, am I a bad boy?
We can't hear you. We might need 2 mics on you. It's not good.
Just give Vivian a hand. Okay. Okay, thank you. This should be okay. And so halfway through ag school, I decided I was going to start practicing to apply for veterinary school. So when the real time came, when I graduated ag school, I know what I was doing. Well, surprise, surprise, the first time I applied for veterinary school, halfway through ag school, got accepted. And so by the time I finished ag school, 2 years later, I was a graduate student, but I also had 2 years left in veterinary school. So I like pathology. So I started taking a lot of pathology courses, graduate courses, and comparative pathology, doing autopsies on humans and animals. And the first winter, as a graduate student, all the professors took off and left the graduates in charge of the various service areas. My service area was pathology. And again, lo and behold, a case came to me in which it was the first mass die-off from pollution in the United States, and I got to write it up, and it became a very famous case. Did all the chemistry, it was just perfect. It was written up in medical journals and veterinary journals and international chemical journals, and that became the driving force of my life, that one study that just was sort of an accidental thing. Well, graduated veterinary school, went to Africa for a couple of years because I had worked with Marlon Perkins as a kid in the summer times. Remember the old Mutual Omaha Wild Kingdom show? I started working for him when I was 14 years old. It was one of my first jobs at the St. Louis with Marlon Perkins. Yeehaw! Okay, so when I graduated veterinary school, I was already kind of 2/3 of the way through my postdoctoral fellowship in comparative pathology. Perkins had a job for me. And how many saw that there's the western black rhino is now extinct in western Canada, western Africa? Did you see that? Yeah. Well, back in 1964, when I graduated veterinary school, Perkins sent me to Africa for 2 years to work with a white rhino in central and southern Africa. There was 250 left, and he set me up in this conservation thing where I was supposed to catch them, and I caught 200 of the 250, sent them back. So if you see a white rhino and an elephant and elephants in the zoo, you either see them as offspring of the ones that I caught or the ones that I caught. Okay? Well, 2/3 of the way through this project, I caught 200 out of the 250. Perkins had gotten a grant from the National Institutes of Health to study pollution in the zoo animals. And the pollution in zoo animals was a great idea. How many remember the old Welsh coal miners taking the canaries down in the mine? Remember that? And the canaries would be more sensitive to the carbon monoxide and methane than the humans, and they would fall off the perch and die long before the men were going to die, so that they could get out. You see the canary drop off, it was time to run. Well, Perkins had this great idea. Well, here's a zoo in a big city that had 400, 500, 600 species of animals in there, and they would die from natural causes. And usually, if they're in good shape, they'd make mounted specimens for museums and things. But if they weren't in good shape, they would just incinerate them, cremate them. And he said, well, we should be able to get some information to see if pollution had anything to do with their causes of death. Well, since I was a comparative pathologist, and as out of courtesy, having worked with Perkins, I used to give him copies of all my scientific articles that I'd written. And so he remembered that I had done all this with the first case of pollution, mass die-off in the United States. Well, he said, we can take 10 years to train somebody. Well, here's a guy, Wallach, he's got a degree in agriculture. He's a veterinarian, he's a pathologist, and this project was a compilation of 3 departments, the Shaw's Botanical Gardens in St. Louis County, the St. Louis Zoological Park, and the Biology Department of Washington University. So my training kind of fit in all those things. So he called me back to work on that project. It was a 10-year project. I'd done over 20,000 autopsies, some 17,500 on over 454 species of animals, not all from the St. Louis Zoo. Zoos all over North America, including Mexico and Canada, all the United States. Little bitty ones they would freeze, and they'd ship them overnight mail to me, and the big ones I'd have to get on a plane with a chainsaw and an axe and go to the zoo where they died and do the autopsy on them. And then there were 3,000 people who had died in close proximity to these zoos. They were also autopsied and checked for pollution problems. Well, the book that came out of that, it's a 1,200-page book. It's in the Smithsonian Institute as a national treasure. And the whole purpose of that book is to be a reference for things that are going on now, comparing the causes of death from pollution and nutritional deficiencies 50 years ago compared to now. And so that book is used as a reference for that purpose. Well, because of the publicity that was associated with that project, I was invited to speak to medical groups, nursing groups, pharmacy groups, dental groups, to give them lectures on nutrition as part of their continuing education so they could keep their licenses. Well, I was an abysmal failure. At getting doctors interested in nutrition. They put their arm around me and say, Wallach, that's all kind of interesting, but it doesn't pay for CAT scans. Okay? And so I went back to school and became a naturopathic physician, graduated from NCM in Portland, Oregon, practiced for 12 years. My patients affectionately said that I treated them like dogs, but they got better. And the reason was, of course, in the waiting room, I had my veterinary degree, which is so big. It was like 3 times as big as my naturopathic degree. And so they'd see that veterinary degree first, and their eyes get very big, and they say, am I in the right place? And the reason was, of course, in the waiting room, I had my veterinary degree, which is so big. It was like 3 times as big as my naturopathic degree. And so they'd see that veterinary degree first, and their eyes get very big, and they say, am I in the right place? And so, yes. So what you're going to get is 33 years of information using veterinary nutritional formulas on human patients. That's what you're going to get from me. And then together we're going to give report cards to the medical system, okay? So we're going to kind of do 2 things at once. I'm going to use overheads to kind of share stuff with you, because if I were just to speak to you without showing you these things, you would think I was sniffing glue, because some of this stuff is so outrageous. If I didn't show you the source, you'd say, yeah, right, Wallach, that's impossible. So here we go. Hold your questions at the end, please. And here we go. This came out, a cover article, Time Magazine, December 2008. The sorry state of American health. Despite advances in medicine, Americans are less healthy than we used to be, and the next generation, our kids, may be worse off. Now, there's 2 pieces here you have to know. Number 1, we spend more money for health care each year than all the other nations of the world put together. Each year, Americans spend more money for health care than all the other nations of the world put together. And yet, our health is getting worse. What they're saying here is our kids are not going to live as long as us, because they were born into a bad system, where many of us are old enough we were born into a good system, and halfway through, somewhere along the line, it got bad. Well, our kids are being born into a bad system between pollution and food that's not good and so on. And so they're saying, experts are now saying, that our kids are not going to live as long as us, and many of you in this room will be standing at graveside burying your children and your grandchildren if we don't change. If you just keep doing what you're doing, it's not going to be good. My favorite Nobel Prize winner, Albert Einstein, said many global things that are unimpeachable, but my favorite is insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So we must change. We must change. The medical system has failed us terribly, and so we have to kind of take over here. Okay? Here we go. Now, one of the most important parts of a human's life, and in any vertebrate's life for that matter, you know, whether it's a hummingbird or a snake or an elephant, giraffe or a human, doesn't matter, is the first third of the pregnancy. This is where you go from a sperm and an egg to a finished product. After the first third of that pregnancy, the rest of it is just growth time. The individual forms in the first third of the pregnancy. Now, we've eliminated every birth defect that you can name and 3 times that many you can't name in animals with preconception nutrition. And repeat that, because you heard me, but you didn't hear me. We've eliminated every birth defect that you can name and 3 times that many that you can't name in the animals, in the animal industry, by simply giving the females preconception nutrition, perfect nutrition before she gets pregnant. In humans, we let everybody run around eating Pop-Tarts and Egos and Mountain Dew and whatever it is they're eating. And then they miss 2 periods when they get old enough to have their own family. They say, oh, you know, I might be pregnant. Well, the embryo's already damaged at that point. We do a much better job for pigs and rats and hamsters than we do for ourselves. And so there should not be a single human baby, certainly in America, born with a birth defect. It's totally preventable if we get every embryo before they're conceived through the pregnancy that they're developed in from the time they're born until they're old enough to have their own families. We have to start somewhere, so we're going to start in the middle here for some people now because we're not embryos anymore. You have to stop that. You do that again, I'll squish you with a squirt gun. You can't name me a disease that's not caused by a nutritional deficiency. Okay, that's very scary. Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, Korsakoff syndrome, vascular dementia,
hyperactivity disorder.
Oh my goodness! Back when I was a kid, there was no such thing as hyperactivity or ADD.
I've seen TV shows. The kid's ADD, and they're interviewing the kid, and he has like Jolly Rancher bag and a Coca-Cola. You're giving him a stimulant, and the kid's sitting with giant black circles around his eyes, and they're going to put him on antipsychotics.
Well, I take those kids, and in 2 weeks' time, they're perfectly normal. You just get them off the sugar, get them off the gluten, make them eat 4 eggs a day. You get them on the, put it in Bluebell ice cream, right? Put the eggs in there, put the eggs on top of it, and then you get them on the Alex pack appropriate for their body weight, and it all goes away. But they got to stay away from sugar, and they got to stay away from gluten. No wheat, brought around oats, and give them the 90 essential nutrients. All that autism, all the ADD, ADHD, hyperactivity goes away. And that's a profound statement. But if you look in that book, Rare Earth Spin Cures, which I believe you have in your store.
Yes.
Rare Earth Spin Cures. I have pictures how you don't need to go to a child psychiatrist to diagnose it. Just get a coloring book and give them just a whole slew of colors. And somebody with ADD or ADHD or autism, they'll pick out the darkest colors. They'll pick out black, purple, dark green, and they won't stay in the lines. They just scribble all over the page. Whereas somebody else, another kid who doesn't have these problems, they'll be impeccable about choosing the perfect color for whatever the subject is, and they'll stay within the line. They're very fastidious about staying in the lines. I was actually up in Canada a couple of weeks ago going to a private school to lecture.
Yes, Dr. Wallach, how you doing?
Fine, sir. Thank you. How can we help you?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is for my son. He has he was diagnosed with a mixed receptive expressive language disorder. He just can't grasp the English language, so he's having a lot of difficulties in that area. And the second one is for me.
Okay, wait a minute. Let's not run away from your son yet. How old is he?
He is 10. He'll be 11 in March.
Okay, does he speak Spanish or German or Russian? I mean...
No, his primary language is English.
Okay. All right, and yourself?
I speak English.
No. I mean, what's your problem?
Sometimes when I sleep, depending on what side I sleep on, I get numbness in my arm all the way down to my fingertips. So I just want to, I'm relatively healthy other than that.
How much do you weigh?
I weigh 200.
Okay, how tall are you?
5'9".
Okay, and how old? Your son is 10 years old?
Yeah, 10 years old.
Okay. Okay, Charmaine, you there?
I'm here.
What do you think is going on with Ernest's son, who's 10 years old? He's having a language problem, and if this gets to be extreme, it can be called nonverbal, where they just don't speak. They're so confused about language, they just don't speak at all. Nonverbal, you see this a lot in things like autism and ADD and ADHD. So what would you say is going on with that kid?
In my opinion, I would say he's got a gluten intolerance and he's not absorbing.
Yeah, exactly. How much does your son weigh?
He's about 80 pounds.
80 pounds? Okay. And what would you give the boy there, Charmaine, to get the nutrients into him, and what would you do for his diet?
Well, he'd got to get on a gluten-free diet, no wheat, barley, rye, or oats, and then for those issues, I'd give him a healthy brain and heart pack, and I would add the synaptive to it.
Absolutely. And, of course, at 80 pounds, I'd treat him like a 100-pounder and give him one healthy brain and heart pack per month, divide everything in half a dose at breakfast, half a dose at dinner time. And, of course, synaptive is the raw materials for the brain cells to make these chemicals so they can speak to each other, so the brain cells can speak to each other, neurotransmitters. So I'd have them take 2 of those tablets twice a day, be 1 bottle a month of the synaptive. And then how many eggs would you have that kid eat a day?
Probably about 4.
Okay, 4, 2 at breakfast, 2 at dinner time. You can put him in a shake. We have a Slender FX shake. Don't mix it with water because he'll lose weight. What you want to do is make it with heavy whipping cream, and then throw 2 or 3 eggs in at breakfast and 2 or 3 eggs in again at dinner time. Have him take those shakes made with the heavy whipping cream and the eggs in it twice a day. And then make sure he stays away from all the bad foods. No sugar, no fried foods, no processed meats, no oils, and no gluten, no wheat, barley, and oats.
So this is one of my playlists for Dr. Joel Wallach, and I recommend people check out some of these videos here. Most of it is just different versions of Dead Doctors Don't Lie, but there are also things about the heart health benefits of supplemental vitamins, the importance of B-complex vitamins, prepare yourself for infectious diseases from 5 years ago, how bad nutrition affects depression, how to get good liver health, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So as I move forward into the next couple videos, I'm going to talk more about alternatives, or better yet, adjunct therapies. So this is how to reverse aging. I want to talk about Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, who's a naturopathic doctor, and her diet that has been proven to reverse biological age. I will also be talking about my favorite gerontologist, who wrote the book True Age. Right now, I would say she's my favorite gerontologist, along with Dr. Rhonda Patrick. Dr. Rhonda Patrick and Dr. Morgan Levine are my 2 favorite. They're tied as my 2 favorite gerontologists. So Morgan Levine is a founding... You want to look for people that know what they're talking about. So Morgan Levine is a founding principal investigator at Altos Labs. Prior to joining the record-breaking startup, she was a ladder-rank professor at Yale University. Her research focuses on the science of biological aging, specifically using bioinformatics to quantify the aging process and test how lifestyle and pharmaceutical interventions alter the rate of aging. As a leading voice in the field of aging and longevity science, she has been featured in media outlets such as CNN, The Guardian, Time, Newsweek, The Huffington Post, the BBC, and many more. She also appeared in the docu-series by Netflix and Goop alongside Gwyneth Paltrow, which was released in early 2020. And this here is my playlist on Dr. Levine. I highly recommend people watch as many of these videos as they can. And I'm gonna, I'll just maybe have her explain what biological age is real quick before I turn off the video here.
Everyone, I think, knows what chronological age is, right? It's the age on your driver's license is essentially how long you've been alive. You can measure it in days, years, months, but probably the more important thing that people don't often think about is what we call your biological age, which is really the kind of state of your aging. So we think of, over your life course, you'll have biological or molecular changes to your system, and that these are actually why we tend to see an increased risk of things like disease incidence, so things like cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, etc., or an increased risk of death as a function of, usually we associate this with your chronological age, but really what's happening is that that's actually associated with this biological aging process that's occurring.
Let's look at that again.
Everyone, I think, knows what chronological age is, right? It's the age on your driver's license is essentially how long you've been alive. You can measure it in days, years, months. But probably the more important thing that people don't often think about is what we call your biological age, which is really the kind of state of your aging. So we think of, over your life course, you'll have biological or molecular changes to your system, and that these are actually why we tend to see an increased risk of things like disease incidence, so things like cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, etc., or an increased risk of death as a function of, usually we associate this with your chronological age, but really what's happening is that that's actually associated with this biological aging process that's occurring.